Good day, historians. Teacher Levy is here. Our topic for today is Philippine history, spaces conflict and controversies. So here we go. Let's discuss Philippine history, spaces conflict and controversies. My name again is Levy Richard B. Isidro, a graduate of MAED Social Studies. So here are the learning objectives of this topic. Number one is to interpret historical events using primary sources. So at the end of this topic, you will be able to interpret some historical events based on the primary sources given. So mag-i-interpret tayo ng mga historical events mula sa mga primary sources natin. So we will have a critical analysis on the primary sources, o yung mga sources na mismong nagmula sa mga witnesses. And next, we have to recognize the multiplicity of interpretation that can be read from historical texts. So, titingnan natin yung iba't ibang interpretations of a certain historical event sa mga historical texts natin or sa mga reference books natin. Next is to identify the advantages and disadvantages of employing critical tools in interpreting historical events through primary sources at yung mga advantages and disadvantages ng paggamit ng critical tools kapag nag-i-interpret tayo ng historical events through the primary sources. Meron kasi mga advantages and disadvantages yan. And last, you will be able to demonstrate ability to argue for or against a particular issue using primary sources. You will learn how to argue on a certain interpretation, whether you will be against or sasang-ayunan mo. So let's go. History is the study of the past. We already know that. But a more contemporary definition is centered on how it impacts the present through its consequences. So mas malapit sa definition ngayon ng history yung mga consequences at yung impact nito sa present. Like Geoffrey Barraclough's definition, history is the attempt to discover, on the basis of fragmentary evidence, the significant things about the past. So, Geoffrey Barraclough said that history is an attempt to discover of what just happened in the past that has significant effect in the present. So, through the fragmented, or when we say fragmented, yung mga pinagpatsi-patsi na mga evidences, yun yung nagpatunay na yun ay totoo. He also noted that the history we read right now through based on facts is strictly speaking not factual at all but a series of accepted judgments. So according to him, judgment na lamang ang history ngayon, not just factual evidential events but judgments. So when we say judgment, it is prejudice. It is based on opinion. It's not factual at all. Depende kung sino yung author ng history, kung paano niya ini-interpret yung mga primary sources natin. So these judgments of the historians, ito yung naging foundation ng mga historical interpretation natin ng past. So what is the point? The point is history is relative. It is based on the author's or historian's interpretation of the facts or evidences that had been discovered. So therefore, history is relative and hindi ito laging totoo, or nothing in history is absolutely true. Pwede itong mabago depende sa interpretation of the historians. If you can still remember the Maragtas legend or the Maragtas story, na kung saan there were 10 datus governing the Visayas in the Philippines before the colonialism, Datu Kalantiaw wrote a code, what had been called as the Code of Kalantiaw. The Code of Kalantiaw is a mythical legal code in the epic history Maragtas. So before it was revealed as a hoax in 2004, it was a source of pride for the people of Aklan. In fact, a historical marker was installed in the town of Batan, Aklan in 1956 with the following text. Code of Kalantiaw, Datu Bendihara Kalantiaw, 3rd Chief of Panay, born in Aklan, established his government in the peninsula of Batang Aklan Sakop. Considered the first Filipino lawgiver, he promulgated in about 1433 a penal code now known as Code of Kalantiaw, containing 18 articles. Don Marcelino Orilla of Zaragoza, Spain, obtained the original manuscript from an old chip of Panay, which later translated into Spanish by Rafael Merviedo Izamani. So sa pagkakaakala nila ang Code of Kalantiaw ay totoo at hindi hoax, nagpatayo pa sila ng marker or historical marker in Batan. It was only in 1968 that it was proved as a hoax. So when William Henry Scott, then a doctoral candidate at the University of Santo Tomas, defended his research on pre-Hispanic sources in Philippine history, he attributed the code to a historical fiction o hindi totoo written in 1913 by Jose E. Marco entitled Las Antiguas Leyendas de la Isla de Negros. So hindi pala totoo ang Code of Kalantiaw. Marco attributed the code itself to a priest named Jose Maria Pavon. Prominent Filipino historians did not dissent to Scott's findings, but there are still some who would like to believe that the code is legitimate document. Of course, Filipino yan eh. Hindi agad sila maniniwala na ito ay hindi totoo because it is a pride and legacy of Visayas. Historians utilize facts collected from primary sources of history and then draw their own reading so that their intended audience may understand the historical event. So after collecting some primary sources and interpreting some primary sources, they will write history accordingly to the capability of the audience to understand it. And this process is somehow, in essence, making sense of the past. The premise is that not all primary sources are accessible to a general audience, so hindi lahat ng primary sources. And without the proper training and background, a non-historian interpreting a primary source may do more harm than good. A primary source may even cause misunderstanding, sometimes even resulting in more problems. So it needs a critical analysis by historians and not anybody who is part of general audience. Interpretations of the past, therefore, vary o paiba-iba depending on who reads the primary source, kung sino nagbasa ng primary source, when it was read, kailan to nabasa, and how it was read, at kung paano ito binasa. So as students of history, we must be well equipped to recognize different types of interpretations, so why this may differ from each other, and how to critically sift these interpretations through historical evaluations. So interpretations of historical events change over time, thus it is an important skill for a student of history to track these changes in an attempt to understand the past. So maganda na magkaroon kayo ng critical analysis of different interpretations of historical texts. What will be the effect if the interpreted part of the history is wrong? So approximately, ang possible na mangyari ay magkaroon ng impact ito sa buhay ng mga estudyante. So it is very important for you to know which part of history and which part of interpretations among the historical text is true. So ang history kasi natin, yan ang magiging guide ninyo sa inyong paraan ng pamumuhay. So the way you look at history will actually affect what is your present and even your future. So kung magkakaroon kayo ng wrong choice of interpretation of history, could lead to a wrong practice of life in present and maybe even the future. So since according to the latest study, Code of Kalantiaw is a hoax, let's now find out sa aking mga kabata. Ito, naalala ko ito noong during 90s, 80s, 90s, usong-uso pa yung salitang ito. Ang hindi magmahal sa kanyang salita, mahigit sa hayop at malansang isda. So maraming gumagamit nito. So let's find out if it is really written by Jose Rizal. Sa aking mga kabata is a poem purportedly written by Jose Rizal when he was 8 years old and is probably one of the Rizal's most prominent works. There is no evidence to support the claim that this poem, with the now immortalized lines, ang hindi magmahal sa kanyang salita, mahigit sa hayop at malansang isda, was written by Rizal, and worse, The evidence against Rizal's authorship of the poem seems all unassailable. So therefore, itong sa aking mga kabata ay mas malinaw na hindi writing ni Jose Rizal. At itong mga evidences laban sa authorship nitong si Rizal of sa aking mga kabata ay mas matimbang na ebidensya. There exists no manuscript of the poem handwritten by Rizal. So wala itong manuscript na isinulat ni Jose Rizal. The poem was published in 1906 in a book by Hermenegildo Cruz. Cruz said he received the poem from Gabriel Beato Francisco, who claimed to have received it in 1884 from the Rizal's close friend na si Saturnino Racelis. Rizal never mentioned writing this poem anywhere in his writings, and more importantly, he never mentioned of having a close friend named Saturnino Racelis. So, si Rizal mismo, wala tayong makikita na writing siya na nagsasabing siya ay may isinulat na sa aking mga kabata. And even Racelis as close friend was not being mentioned by any writings of Jose Rizal. Further criticism of the poem reveals more about the wrongful attribution of the poem to Rizal. The poem was written in Tagalog and referred to the word kalayaan. Isa pa sa mga nagpadagdag at nagpatunay na hindi si Jose Rizal ang sumulat ng sa aking mga kabata ay yung mismong paggamit ng salitang kalayaan sa mismong poem. These two references ring a bell because kalayaan, as we know it today, was not widely used in the 19th century. As a matter of fact, Rizal encountered the word first in the summer of 1882 when he was 21 years old. 21 years old na siya nung nagagamit na niya ang salitang kalayaan. But it was documented in Rizal's letters that he first encountered the word through a Marcelo H. del Pilar's translation of Rizal's essay El Amor Patrio, where it was spelled as kalayahan. While Rizal's native tongue was Tagalog, he was educated in Spanish starting from his mother, Teodora Alonso. Later on, he would express disappointment in his difficulty in expressing himself in his native tongue. Even mismo si Jose Rizal ay disappointed sa paggamit niya ng kanyang native tongue dahil hindi siya ganun kagaling dito. So mas lalo na kung ito ay attributed sa kanya when he was 8 years old, o yung sa aking mga kabata ay 8 years old pa lamang daw, ay sinulat na ni Rizal. So dito talaga ay parang merong mali attributing sa aking mga kabata kay Jose Rizal. His spelling is also suspect. The use of letters K and W to replace C and U respectively was suggested by Rizal as an adult. So matanda na si Rizal nung sinuggest niya na palitan ang C at U gamit ang K and W na makikita natin sa poem when he was 8 years old, if he was really the author. If the poem was indeed written during his time, it should use the original Spanish orthography that was prevalent in his time. So if this is true, ang mas gagamitin niyang letters ay C at yung U during his time. Many of the things we accept as true about the past might not be the case anymore. So yung dati nating alam na akala natin totoo ay hindi na pala totoo ngayon. So kagaya nitong sa aking mga kabata, ang tagal nating nabuhay na ito ay ginagamit natin at sinasabi natin na si Rizal ang nagsulat. Just because these were taught to us as facts when we were younger does not mean that it is set in stone. History is, after all, a construct. And as a construct, it is open for interpretation. There might be conflicting and competing accounts of the past that need one's attention can impact the way we view our country's history and identity. At sinasabi ko kanina na malaking effect yung paniniwala ng isang part of the history that had been interpreted as true. So, hindi ito laging masasabi natin laging totoo. So, we need to have a critical analysis of certain facts in our history, lalo na kung itinuturo ito sa ating mga eskwelahan. It is important, therefore, to subject to evaluation not only the primary source, hindi lang primary source ang dapat natin evaluate, but also the historical interpretation of the same. So, yung historical interpretation per se, syempre, ng mga libro natin, kagaya nila Ambet R. Ocampo, to ensure that the current interpretation is reliable to support our acceptance of events of the past. With several possibilities of interpreting the past, sa dami ng mga posibilidad sa pag-interpret ng mga history natin, another important concept that we must note is what we call multiperspectivity. So this can be defined as a way of looking at historical events, personalities, development cultures, and societies from different perspectives. So iba-iba ang perspective kung paano nila tinitingnan yung historical event, yung mga personalities natin in our history, and the development of cultures, pati yung development ng societies natin. So there are certain standards of these different perspectives. So this means that there is a multitude of ways by which we can view the world, and each could be equally valid and at the same time equally partial as well. So ibig sabihin, pwedeng lahat naman ay tama or there are elements of truth. Iba naman, sometimes pwedeng bias lang or unfair. So, depende kung paano natin siya titingnan. So, for example, sabi ko nga sa ating classes, so, if the historian, the one who will interpret the history of the Philippines is coming from the Spain or US, syempre, it will be interpreted on the advantage of their country. So, kung Pilipino naman ang historian natin, it would be in the advantage of the Filipinos. So, it is depending on the perspective, is depending on the biases of the writers or the authors or the historians per se. Historical writing is by definition biased, so hindi patas, partial, yun nga, and contains preconceptions. Meron ng preconceptions yan, so may pananaw na yan bago pa man nila isulat. So, the historian decides on what sources to use. Pinipili rin nila yung mga sources na gagamitin nila. Siyempre, it would be based on their biases. So, what interpretation to make more apparent, ano yung mas gusto nilang liwanagin, depending on what his end is, kung ano yung purpose niya, no? So, historians may misinterpret evidence, attending to those that suggest that a certain event happened and then ignore the rest that goes against the evidence. So, sa mga ilang pag-aaral, ito tinatawag nilang eisegesis Pero ang punto natin dito, there are so many perspectives to consider, no, interpreting a certain part of the history. So kung ikaw ay makadilaw when you are interpreting the part of history where the Duterte administration is conducting its administration, maaaring ibabase mo to sa mga perspective ng mga dilaw o opposition. Pero kapag ikaw naman ay pro-Duterte, i-check mo naman kung ano yung pabor para kay Duterte. So, bias yung history na isusulat ng mga dilawan, bias din ang isusulat na history ng mga pro-Duterte natin. So, the question is, which is which? Alin ang tama at alin ang mas totoo? So, yun ang dahilan kung bakit kailangan yung mag-aral ng critical analysis. So, you will be the one who will criticize and analyze a certain historical event as a student. Historians may omit significant facts about their subject, which makes the interpretation unbalanced. So tingnan nyo yung ginagawa ng mga media natin ngayon, and even some writers natin ngayon. Tinitingnan lang nila isang portion ng truth, tapos ipapublic nila. So ang resulta, magkakaroon ng unbalanced interpretation. So yung mga public naman, hindi na nila chine-check, naniniwala na lang sila. Historians may impose a certain ideology, pati ideology could be leftist or rightist to their subject, which may not be appropriate to the period the subject was from. Historians may also provide a single cause for an event without considering other possible causal explanations of said event. So, ang best example natin dito yung EDSA 1, okay? So, ano ba talaga ang tunay na dahilan kung bakit nagkaroon ng EDSA 1? So, ang laging sinasabi is the authoritarianism of Ferdinand E. Marcos. So, ang kinonsider lang dyan ay isang cause ng part of the history. Napakarami pang causes kung bakit nagkaroon ng EDSA 1. Pwedeng mayroong political ideology na gustong ipasok. Pwede rin naman totoo na mayroon talagang problema sa dictatorship nito si Ferdinand E. Marcos. But in certain writings in history, ang lagi lang binabanggit ay yung dictatorship problem nitong si Ferdinand E. Marcos. So there should be a lot of causes which were not written as part of history. These are just many of the ways a historian may fail in his historical inference, description, and interpretation. So isa lang to sa mga possible na dahilan kung bakit nagfa-fall o nagfa-fail ang isang historian, kasi pwede siyang may biases o may opinion na siya bago niya simulan ang pag-interpret ng facts or historical events. So, with multiperspectivity as an approach in history, we must understand that historical interpretation contain discrepancies, contradictions, ambiguities, and are often the focus of dissent. So, maraming mga kulang, discrepancies, contradictions, o yung pwedeng magbangga-bangga yung mga histories, ambiguities, kaguluhan, no? And often focus of dissent, or kadalasan opinionated. Exploring multiple perspectives in history requires incorporating source materials that reflect different views. So, dapat ipasok natin yung other sources na minsan hindi kamukha nung isa. So, we need to identify the different sources or materials na nagre-reflect ng iba't ibang views sa event or isang certain historical event. Because singular historical narrative do not provide for space to inquire and investigate. Hindi pwedeng isa lang o na narrative ang gagamitin natin. So, kukulangin siya as support to a certain fact. Different sources that counter each other may create space for more investigation. So, mas nakikita natin yung different views. Mas nakikita natin na mas kailangan pa ang pag-imbestiga and research while providing more evidence for those truths that these sources agree on. So, kung halimbawa meron silang pinag-aagrihan na isang certain truth, kung 5 yung mga sources natin at iba-iba ang sinasabi at sila ay nagkasundo sa isang fact, that could be true. So, we should just provide more evidences just to prove that this part of history is true. So, maganda na may iba't ibang views na makikita sa ating historical analysis. Different kinds of sources also provide different historical truth. An official document may note different aspects of the past than, say, a memoir of an ordinary person on the same event. Different historical agents create different historical truths, and while this may be burdensome work for the historian, it also renders more validity to the historical scholarship. Taking this in close regard to the reading of historical interpretations, it provides for the audience a more complex but also a more complete and richer understanding of the past. So, mas maraming official document, mas marami kang magamit na historical agents, mas marami kang mapoprovide na historical truths. At though mas mahirap ito para sa mga historians, mas nagiging valid naman at mas nagiging scholarly ang pag-aaral ng history or interpretation of the history because of these so many things to consider in writing or interpreting a certain history. Mas maraming complexities sa pag-aaral ng history, mas maraming matututunan ng ating audience at mas richer ang understanding of the past. So, to give an example or analogy in the multiperspectivity of history, tingnan natin itong red apple na to. Itong red apple na to, as you can see it, wala siyang kagat dito sa portion ng view na ito o sa perspective na ito. Sabihin natin na ang mga tumitingin dito ay yung mga pro Duterte. So, para sa mga pro Duterte, pag sumulat sila ng isang article, ang ipapakita lamang nila ay yung mismong side na ito. So, let's say for example, ito yung kanan na side ng apple. So, yung kanan na side ng apple, yan yung nakikita ng mga pro Duterte. So, tingnan naman natin yung kabilang side. Ayan, on the left side pala, ito naman ang tinitingnan ng mga dilawan or mga opposition. So, kapag ka sila sumulat ng part ng history or an articles, syempre ang ikukwento nila may kagat na yung apple. So, kung ano yung kalat ni Duterte, yun ang kanilang isusulat. So, merong multi-perspectivity yan. Yan ang problema, may bias. So, sa huli, ang walang ibang mag-check or mag-evaluate ng truth or part of the history kundi tayong mga mismong citizen. So, it's our job to critically analyze and evaluate what is the truth, kung ano ba talaga yung totoo. So kailangan natin matuto mag-aral to consolidate different sources of facts at tayo mismo mag-interpret base sa ating nakikita. So I hope you guys learned a lot in our discussion, and I hope that everybody is learning and becoming historian. So sana lahat tayo ay matutong maging historian, na kung saan we can interpret facts, we can interpret history, at matutunan natin mag-analyze and criticize history. So yung mga controversies na diniscuss natin sa ating history ay sana may natutunan kayo. Oops, it's already time, and it's time to say goodbye. So next time we will be discussing the first mass happened in the Philippines. Could it be in Limasawa or in Butuan? So paabangan na lang po kung ano yung ating magiging discussion. So if you have any question, pwede po kayong mag-post or mag-comment lang doon sa ating comment section. And if you have time, subscribe to my channel. Once again, my name is Levi Richard Isidro, and I believe that the gospel of Christ is the only absolute. Bye-bye!